Hi everyone, and welcome to the first of your introductory videos on the psychological approaches, assumptions and concepts, which will be part of your Unit 1 examination that you take in BTEC Applied Psychology. So you're hopefully going to watch a series of these introductory videos, and they'll all take a similar format, I would expect, whereby I'm going to introduce you to the specification first and foremost, so you get a bit of an overview of what we're going to be covering in this intro video. You will also, for all of these introductory videos, require the booklet available to you because you're going to be completing that as we go through the video. It would also probably be a good idea to have paper and pen at the side of you as well before we get started, because there are some little additional notes that you might want to take for things like glossaries, especially if you're not very good with kind of learning new terminology. It might just be an idea to write that down somewhere which you can keep in your folder. And also a good old highlighter is always a good shout. So you might want to pause this video here just before we get started. Make sure you've got everything available to you and then come back and we'll get cracking. Okay, so the first introductory video that I'm going to take you through for Unit 1 Approaches and Assumptions is the behaviourist and the social learning approaches. Now, with all of the key approaches that we're going to cover as part of this Unit 1 exam, there are several things that you will need to be familiar with. So each approach is broken into two separate sections. The first section is known as the key assumptions, and the second section is known as key concepts. And within the key concepts, that's usually quite broad ranging, and there are a number of different things, key ideas that we'll cover with you in there. But we're going to begin with the key assumptions because that might not be a term that you're actually that familiar with. Apologies, don't know what happened there. So if you can do me a favour, please, and let's get ready to kind of fill in some of your booklet. If you open up your booklet, we're on the top of page 5, and we're going to take a look at the first of our key assumptions. And as I've already stated, this is for the learning approach. So before we can do this, you really need to know what a key assumption actually is. So it would be a good idea for you to add this to the top of page 5 because it's not actually in there. So when I and when your other teachers are referring to an assumption, what we mean by that is a shared set of beliefs that are used to explain human behaviour in some way. And the reason why we refer to assumptions is because there are loads and loads of different approaches within psychology, and they all have different beliefs about how we best explain human behaviour. So the assumptions that you hold underpin exactly what you choose to investigate and exactly how you will do that. So different approaches have different assumptions, and they therefore have different aspects of human behaviour that they're interested in, and they investigate it in very, very different ways also. So that's what we mean when we refer to assumptions throughout this booklet. So for each of the different approaches, you've got to know a core set of assumptions that relate to the approaches. So our first approach, again, just to re-emphasise, is the learning approach. So we're going to go ahead and start filling in the key assumptions actually into our booklets. So the learning approach is often called the behaviourist approach as well. So it might be an idea for you to just pop that into your booklets, or at least highlight it at the top of page 5, because I don't want anybody to get confused with me referring to those two terms interchangeably. They both mean the same thing. So a behaviourist is a learning theorist is a behaviourist. So just make that stand out. So the first kind of key idea that we need to understand about learning theorists or behaviourists is that they believe that all behaviour is learnt, or at least it's observed from other people. Okay, so that's an overarching kind of key idea. And then we can break that down further into two core assumptions. So the first core assumption, as you can see in your booklet and as I've got on the screen here, is that John Watson, who is a key kind of behaviourist in this particular field, proposed that behaviour is learned from an environmental stimuli. So everything that you know, everything that you are, everything that you do, or the ways in which you act, has been previously learned from an environmental stimuli. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to complete this little word bank, okay? So don't write it in just yet. I'll give you the right answers in a second, but take a look at the words at the bottom of my screen, okay? Pause the video here and see if you can figure out what spaces those terms go in, just based on that, what I've already said to you there. So pause this here and see if you can figure out the order of those words. Okay, great. Hopefully you've given that a chance. So let's go ahead and fill in the right answers. So genes and other inherited factors play a minimal role in behaviour. In fact, some extreme behaviourists argue that they don't do anything at all. They merely contribute superficial things like your hair colour, your eye colour, your stature, etc. But they don't actually contribute in any way to behaviour. What they argue instead is that when we are born, our mind is a blank slate. Now, to use the correct terminology in psychology, that would be a tabula rasa. So that is a blank slate. They also believe that behaviour is a result of stimulus response. So when John Watson claimed that all behaviour is learned from environmental stimuli, this is what he meant. All behaviour is a product of stimulus response connections and also observations of past behaviour. So our experiences of this world has forced us into learning how to respond in those situations. It might be things that we didn't want to learn, for example, fears and phobias. They're things that you have learned from a stimulus response interaction, but you can't shake them off. They are ingrained into you. You have learned them from your interaction with the environment around you. So that's our first key assumption. Might be an idea as we're going through just to highlight any of the key terms. So whenever I do a gap fill, most of the time the things that have been gapped out are the important bits of terminology. So you might want to highlight that now, guys. The second key assumption is to do with observational learning, i.e. we monkey see, monkey do. Virtually everything that you know has been observed by you from another person, okay? So if you think of the most simple and straightforward things that you learnt to do as a child, for example, eating, tying your shoelaces, how to get dressed, how to go to the toilet, how to bathe, all of those simple things all came from seeing somebody else do them first. And that's what we call vicarious reinforcement. So individuals watch other people's behaviour, and this happens all the way through a lifespan, not just in childhood. We're constantly learning from watching others. But we watch other people's behaviour and we then process the consequences of it. And this key assumption would argue that if the consequences are positive and you see a role model being rewarded for something, then you are more likely to imitate it. It also states, and let's fill this term in as well, that internal mental processes are taken into account in learning. So you consider the consequences. What will happen to you if you were to repeat that same action? And that will factor into your decision as to whether or not you choose to imitate that behaviour. So they're the two key assumptions. And like I said, get used to that terminology, get familiar with what the key assumptions of the learning approach are, because I would say this is probably the most common exam question on Unit 1 Applied Psychology. They always ask about the key assumptions. So already getting to grips with what they mean by that. So once you're done with page 5, we're going to move into the first of our key concepts. Okay, so the first key concept is something called conditioning. You don't need to write anything in your booklet at this point. So conditioning was first introduced by John Watson in the early 20th century, so 1920s-ish. And he was famously quoted as saying the following: "If you give me a dozen healthy infants who are well formed and my own specified world to bring them up, and I will guarantee to take anyone at random and I can train them to become any type of specialist that I might select. I can make them become a doctor, a lawyer, an artist, a merchant chief, and yes, even a beggarman or a thief. Regardless of their talents, regardless of their penchants, so their favours, their tendencies, their abilities, their vocations, and most importantly, their ancestral history." So it says to discuss on your tables, but I know you're doing this task independently. Just mull that over. What do you think that means? Again, you might want to pause it here. What do you think that means? What do you think he's getting at? Okay. So hopefully you just had time to think about that kind of statement there. And John Watson was really getting at this idea that it's all to do with environment. It's all to do with the world in which you are brought up in. It's nothing to do with where you have come from or your genetic inheritance. What you are as a person now is a product of your interaction with the environment around you. And one of the ways in which we learn, according to John Watson, is via conditioning. One specific type of conditioning is known as classical conditioning. So I'm going to show you this short video clip here. Observe kind of what's going on and think if you have had any similar experiences. Okay, just going to load this up. Just bear with me. Here we are.
Hey Psych 101 class, I'm David and I'm going to be testing Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning on my roommate Brian. The conditioned stimulus will be the sound effect.
That was easy.
And then I'm going to shoot him with this airsoft gun. He will soon learn the relationship between the sound effect and the shot before he gets too hurt.
That was easy. That was easy.
Ah!
That was easy.
Fuck.
That was easy. That was easy.
Alright guys, looks like Pavlov's theory worked.
Okay, so let's just go back into our presentation. Apologies, I'll just open this up now. Let's go back into our presentation and just discuss what that meant, that video clip there. So what you saw was somebody forming a stimulus response to a particular object. In this case, it was a sound. So the buzzer that he was pressing was then closely followed by the pellet gun, I think it was. And what happened over repeated pairing of the sound with the buzzer gun was that he learned that it was going to happen, and he started to have a response to the buzzer on its own. And what eventually happened is that he didn't need the pellet gun to be fired for him to flinch in the same way that he would have done had it actually have fired. And that's what we call classical conditioning. So I'd like you to just think for a moment, if you can, to come up with some of your own real life examples of where you think you might have been classically conditioned to respond to a particular stimulus. So as you just get you thinking, my example would be this. So my example is fish in any sort of cream sauce makes me feel sick because I once got so extreme food poisoning after eating it that I ended up in hospital. So now I associate that stimulus with vomiting. And even just sitting here saying the words can make my mouth water. It's that extreme of a response. So pause the video here and then see if you can come up with some examples of your own. Okay, so hopefully that was a bit of food for thought. These are 3 other examples that I'm giving you. You could add these to the top of page 6 if you want to, just so that you are familiar with what we mean by classical conditioning. But getting a speeding ticket, all right, on a particular road and then feeling anxious when you are driving through that road kind of from that point forward. Having food poisoning after eating spaghetti bolognese and then feeling sick every time you think of it. And then having a phobia of dogs after being bitten by one, when you were younger. All real life examples of classical conditioning. So we're going to now dig in a little bit further and we're going to look at some of the key concepts, some of the key bits of terminology that you need to get to grips with in order to understand what classical conditioning is, how it happens and how we actually describe it. So you might want to highlight on the top of page 6 that classical conditioning is learning by association. That's a real kind of key idea for you to get to grips with. And there is a specific set of key terms that we need to be referring to when we're actually describing classical conditioning. So, classical conditioning, as I've said, is learning via association, where a stimulus and a response are associated together. And it was first researched by a guy called Ivan Pavlov, who wasn't actually a psychologist. It says in the booklet that he was, but he wasn't. He was primarily a biologist. He actually favoured working with animals, and he was interested in animal behaviour. But he came across this really kind of unique experience of behaviour, and then that suddenly took him into a world of psychology where you could use the same concept to explain all kinds of human behaviours. Now, what originally happened with Pavlov is that he noticed that dogs were trained, or he could train dogs rather, to salivate to the sound of a bell, because the dogs were used to salivating to the food, and Pavlov found that if he paired the bell at the same time as the food, then they would learn that the bell meant the food, which would ultimately result in kind of salivation without any food being present. So that's what we mean by learning through association. Those dogs learnt a new response, so salivation, to a particular stimulus, which in this case was the bell. So as I previously said, there are some bits of terminology, which you do need to kind of utilise when you're describing classical conditioning. So it might be an idea to copy these down. These are just bits of vocabulary, and if you do struggle with terminology, it's always handy to just have these written somewhere. So the first term that I want to introduce you to, which you will need in order to explain classical conditioning, is the neutral stimulus. So a neutral stimulus is an object or a sound, a stimulus of some sort that we as humans have no natural response to, and it doesn't usually affect behaviour. So in explaining this terminology, I'm going to use the example of learning to be afraid of a feather. You might often wonder, why are people afraid of such random things? Classical conditioning can go some way to explaining that. So in that scenario, learning to be afraid of a feather, the feather starts as a neutral stimulus. Ordinarily, humans are not afraid of that object. They have no response to it whatsoever. It might make somebody tickle if you put it in the right place, but it doesn't usually evoke any sort of natural reflex response. So it's a neutral stimulus. What we also need to refer to when we're describing how classical conditioning occurs is an unconditioned stimulus. Now, this is the opposite to a neutral stimulus. This is an environmental stimulus which in humans causes a natural or reflex response. So with our example, how does somebody become afraid of a feather? Our unconditioned stimulus, the thing that will evoke a reflex in them, is a loud noise of some sort. We are all born with the startle response, so a loud noise would automatically create some sort of reaction in a human. The next bit of terminology that we need is an unconditioned response. So this is just the response that you would have to the unconditioned stimulus. So as I've just said, with the startle reflex, if you're exposed to a loud noise, the jump that you experience is the unconditioned response. The UCS, the unconditioned stimulus, is the noise. The startle reflex to jump, for your heart to race, is the unconditioned response. It is the behavioural reaction to that particular stimulus. So how do we end up being conditioned then? How do we end up with a conditioned stimulus? A conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that you have learnt to respond to. So in my little example, remember that's going to be the feather. The conditioned stimulus is whatever the neutral stimulus was to begin with. It becomes conditioned. It becomes something that you have learnt to respond to. So if we're training somebody to go through conditioning, that's because these two stimuli have been paired together. Okay, so for example, the loud noise and the feather have appeared potentially together, okay? Normally with conditioning, it has to happen on several occasions. If it's a trauma experience, then it can only happen once and the effect will be the same. So in my example, if a person is presented with a feather at the same time as a loud bang, eventually the feather will cause a fear response, and that is how you might eventually end up with a fear of what was a neutral stimulus. You are now conditioned to be afraid of that particular neutral stimuli. So how then? Let me budge through past this one. We don't really need this one. So how then did Pavlov do this with his dogs? So we're back on page 6 in your booklet. So Pavlov attempted to condition dogs by pairing the neutral stimulus which was the bell, with the food, which was the unconditioned stimulus. Again, you might want to highlight this, but this is the same as what you've got in your booklet. So the food is an unconditioned stimulus. Dogs automatically have a response to food, which is to salivate, which is the unconditioned response. So could you train a dog to salivate to a neutral stimulus, a bell, which means nothing to the dog at all? The answer is yes, absolutely you can. Repeat that process enough times where the bell is paired with the food, so a neutral stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus. Over time, the bell goes on to become a conditioned stimulus, i.e. an object that you have learnt to respond to, and the salivation response is the new learnt response in the dog. So conditioning occurs all around us. So what we're going to now have a look at is an example of conditioning in real life. So I'd like you to turn the page to page 7, and we're just going to try and do this one together, and then your teacher will do some more activities on this with you in class. So Layla is a professional photographer. She often takes photos of people indoors using a flash. The camera also makes a whirring noise when the picture is taken. Layla has noticed that most people blink the first couple of times that the flash goes off. What do you think would happen if Layla took a photo without the flash on? And can you explain why? So in order to do that, we're going to complete the terminology, okay? So we always start with a neutral stimulus. If you can establish what the neutral stimulus is in one of these scenarios, you'll understand the rest of it. So if we recall, a neutral stimulus is a stimulus that doesn't actually create any response in humans. So the neutral stimulus in this particular example is the camera, or more specifically the noise that the camera is making. The unconditioned stimulus, which is the thing that we do have a natural response to, in this example, is the flash. The response to the flash, so the unconditioned response, is to blink. Because those two things have been paired together and the camera always makes the whirring noise, if you were to take a picture without the flash, the people who were having their photograph taken would still blink. The camera or the noise of the camera would be enough to make them blink without the flash being present, because they have associated the noise with the blink. So that's a real life example then of classical conditioning. And as I said, your teacher will do way more activities with you to make sure that everybody's kind of understood those concepts. So at this point, we're going to move away from classical conditioning and now on to our second key concept, which is operant conditioning. Probably won't take us as long to do this one, so just a handful more minutes now, guys. Okay, so operant conditioning, again, if you've got your booklet in front of you on page 8, let's highlight some of the key terms. Operant conditioning is learning via consequences, where we form a link between a behaviour, so an action, and its consequences, which are the results. And it was originally investigated, as you can see in your booklet, by a guy called B.F. Skinner in 1932. And I will go into some more detail in a moment. But traditionally, when we're talking about operant conditioning, we talk about two different types of consequences that we can face. So we talk about reinforcement, all right? So you're probably familiar with that word. Reinforcement is receiving something that makes you want to perform an action again. If you reinforce, you're being rewarded. Whereas punishment has the opposite desired effect, okay? If you punish for something, the intent is that you won't do it again. So B.F. Skinner was investigating the two different types of consequences. He was investigating reinforcement and then latterly punishment as well, but not really in his original experiment. So I'm going to talk to you about that in a moment. So as I've just said, B.F. Skinner was the first person to investigate this, and he traditionally did it using a piece of apparatus called the Skinner box. So you can see this here, and you can highlight some of the bits and bobs if you want. So a rat was placed into the Skinner box, okay, and he was trying to demonstrate two types of reinforcement: positive and negative reinforcement. So first of all, he wanted to see what happened if he were to add something pleasant for the rats. The aim of the game, whilst they were in the Skinner box, was to press this lever, okay, to learn to press the lever. So Skinner thought, how can I encourage those rats to press that lever more frequently, more regularly? So positive reinforcement in the Skinner box meant that via the pellet dispenser, a pellet of food was distributed to the rat every time they pressed the lever. So the first time they did it, it was just coincidence. Then they received a bit of food. The rats very quickly learned that every time they press that lever, a little bit of food gets released into it. And they very, very quickly observed this pattern where they would press it repeatedly. The second trial that took place in the Skinner box was to see what happened if you face the rat with something that they didn't necessarily enjoy. So could you create a situation where they learnt to press the lever because it took away something that they weren't enjoying? So you can see underneath the rats that there's an electric grid which was activated, but the rats could switch it off themselves by pressing the lever. So this trial worked in the exact same way as the food pellet trial. The rats very quickly observed that that lever switched off the electric grid. There was also a little signal light in front of them which told them that the electric grid was going to be switched on. As soon as they saw that light and the electric grid was switched on, they knew that the lever could turn it off. And the rats learned these two behaviours quite succinctly, quite easily. And Skinner observed this pattern of behaviour a number of times. So I've referred to in that previous segment on the Skinner box about two different types of reinforcement. So with your consequences with operant conditioning, there is reinforcement and there is punishment. But it gets a little bit more complex than that because we have two types of reinforcement and two types of punishment. So reinforcement, without kind of making it too confusing to begin with, always increases the chances of you carrying out a behaviour again. But there are two different ways in which you can receive reinforcement. So one way is positive reinforcement, which is where we are adding to a scenario a stimulus which is pleasant to the person. So think of positive in like math terms, which means to add. Now, if it's going to reinforce behaviour and increase the likelihood that you want to do it again, then that positive reinforcement has obviously got to be something nice, okay? So you perform an action, you receive a reward, something that you enjoy, you want to do it again. Negative reinforcement is slightly more complex because negative reinforcement still encourages a behaviour being carried out again, but we do that by removing an unpleasant stimulus. So anything that you do, for example, that relieves stress is negative reinforcement. So, for example, exercising. You might exercise to get rid of your stress. That is negative reinforcement. That encourages you to exercise again and again and again because you are removing something which you don't enjoy, which is the stress. So positive reinforcement, you're adding something nice, which makes you want to do it again. Negative reinforcement, you're repeating a behaviour because it removes something that you don't enjoy. So as I've said, think of positive and negative as adding and taking away. With punishment, it's obviously the similar sort of concept repeated, but having the opposite effect. So what I mean by that is that these now reduce the chances of you carrying out a behaviour again. So positive punishment, if you are being punished, then that decreases the chance of you carrying out a behaviour again. So therefore, positive punishment has got to be adding something that you don't like. So a child being shouted at, for example, it is adding something into the scenario which they don't enjoy, which should hopefully deter them from doing that behaviour again. Negative punishment, which tends to be the most powerful type of punishment, is when a behaviour is followed by removing something that we enjoy. All right, so I'll give you 2 examples there. Sending to a bedroom, going to the naughty step, taking away a mobile phone. That's a negative punishment act. You are stopping that behaviour being carried out again by removing something that the person does enjoy. So again, just make sure that you've got kind of those descriptions popped into your booklet somewhere on page 9. We're now going to go ahead and actually fill in the gaps that are in your booklet just to re-emphasise this. So top of page 9 then. So 1 consequence is reinforcement. This increases the probability of behaviour being repeated, as I've already told you. So positive reinforcement, occurs when a behaviour is followed by. Now, what did we say? What we're going to put in there? Begins with a P. Okay, we got it. It's a pleasant consequence, which reinforces the behaviour and makes it more likely to be repeated. Again, can you figure out what goes in there? The example is from the Skinner rats. So what was the positive reinforcement, the thing that was provided to the rats that they enjoyed? Have you got that one? So that would be the food pellets. So giving them the food pellets for pressing the lever. Negative reinforcement is when we remove something pleasant. Remove something unpleasant, which makes the behaviour more likely to be repeated. So again, in the Skinner's rats example, what was removed when they pressed the lever? You remember? It was the electric grid. So that's negative reinforcement, taking away something unpleasant, which makes them more likely to press that lever again. So making sure we've got those 2 examples filled in. We're now going to fill in punishment, but I want you to put a cross through or a line through the 2 examples for Skinner's rats, because they're not quite right for the Skinner box and I don't want to confuse you. So we've just said punishment takes 2 forms, but it always reduces the probability that you repeat a behaviour. So positive punishment, can we remember what we said? Positive punishment, which is going to stop you from doing it again, means that a behaviour is followed by what kind of a consequence? We got this? It's an unpleasant consequence. Whereas negative punishment is the removal of something pleasant, which you enjoy, which makes you less likely to want to do that behaviour that caused it being removed in the first place again. So I'm going to ask you now, final thing, to try and match those 2 examples. Which one is positive punishment and which one is negative punishment? So which one is adding something unpleasant, which means you're less likely to do it again, and which one is removing something pleasant, which you don't enjoy, so therefore you avoid repeating that behaviour. So hopefully we've got these the right way round. A speeding fine would be positive punishment, whereas taking a child's Xbox away for swearing would be a negative punishment. So they're all the activities I'd got for you today, guys. I've covered a lot of the key concepts there. Go back over them before your lesson, and then your teacher will consolidate all of this with some more activities and some exam questions in all likelihood. Okay, I hope you found that helpful. Bye for now.